Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. The comments, opinions, and views shared during this program are those of individual Freemasons and do not reflect the official position of a Grand Lodge, concordant body, appendant body, or Masonic authority. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com. A quick reminder, you can now listen early and ad-free with our new subscriber offer. Get the link to start your 7-day free trial and the show notes for this episode. You've joined us for a special program on Entering the Apprentice as we dive into the historical degree with our special guest, Brother Matthew Brockbank from my mother lodge, St. George's Lodge number 6 in Schenectady, New York. Welcome to the podcast, Brother Brockbank.
Wow. I just got to say, I thought you pre-recorded those intros and outros, but no, for listeners, he does this live every time.
Every time, yeah.
Wow. I give you a ton of credit. And it sounds so official hearing it, happen to me because I did a little bit of homework and listened to quite a bit of your backlog just to, get a feel for it. And I'm like awestruck.
Nice. And one of the reasons we brought Brother Brockbank in is because there's so much of Freemasonry and our lessons that are tucked into the historical lecture, as we call it in New York ritual, after the first degree. And really the purpose of that lecture is to provide instruction on the history, origins, and symbolism that's all in the Entered Apprentice Degree. Just for a fun fact, I've mentioned you twice on this podcast in previous episodes, which you probably listened to, as you're and are the brother from my mother lodge who performs this portion of the degree. You're basically a specialist. So my first question is, how did you find this role delivering the historical lecture for newly obligated brethren at St. George's Lodge in Schenectady?
I became a Master Mason, as you know, in St. George's. And we have a lot of talented guys there who, I guess at the time, they kind of owned, individual parts of the degree, as most lodges, I think, do. You find one guy who really, is passionate about a certain part, and that brother, just delivers it so well. So that brother is the one. He's the guy that does that part. So at this point, we had another younger-ish brother who was excellent at giving the first degree historical lecture, but he was just done being master of the lodge and he was moving away from Masonry. His kids were, coming of age, which is, understandable. It was, he was kind of meeting a crossroads in life. So he kind of stepped back from Masonry a little bit to spend more time with his family. And the lecture was up for grabs. So at that time, I think I took on, I want to say about a third of it, up to and including the jewels, but that was it. And from there, that was my first go. And that was a pretty large, substantial chunk, for the first time. But other brothers took a couple of the other smaller parts that followed. And I think, they were already probably doubling up on parts for the first degree. And so as time went on, I just kind of consumed or took more and more of the lecture until I had the whole thing kind of front to back, memorized word for word.
In New York State, kind of the structure for the Entered Apprentice Degree is we have a portion that's called the Whys and Wherefores, which is traditionally performed by two brothers, one asking the question, the other giving a more larger answer response that leads to some of the history of Freemasonry. Then we have the historical lecture, which gets into, and a lot of that is in open print, so we can talk pretty openly about it. It gets into how a lodge is situated, some of the history of Freemasonry. One of my favorite parts, the point within a circle. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then the follow-up would be the Q&A, which we refer to as the catechism, which two brothers go back and forth on that. And then at the end, we have the charge, which by that point, the poor brother that has just been newly obligated as an entered apprentice Mason is soaking wet from the fire hose of instruction that happens that night.
Yeah.
When this opportunity came up, there's other parts of the ritual that you probably could have stepped up and shown an interest in. Was it just a need that you wanted to fulfill, or were you like, hey, I really like this portion of the degree?
Well, I do really like this portion of the degree for a couple reasons. The historical lecture itself is just, as you kind of have said already, it's just chock full of, little tidbits, little, no pun intended, little jewels of Masonry. You could probably take in the historical lecture, you know, every other sentence, there's something in there that you could just, do a whole episode, a whole podcast on. A point within a circle. That is one part of to whom the lodge is dedicated. I mean, that's not even a part in itself, but you can do a whole podcast episode on one sentence, one idea. So the historical lecture is fun for me because of that. There's just so much going on there. I like it quite a bit. So, the historical lecture was, something that I thought I could make a mark with. And it was really something that a lot of other brothers were, a little intimidated to do the whole thing. And I think that with the historical lecture, there are certain points in your monologue there that you could, yeah, there's good break points. There are kind of rougher break points, if you will. So you could kind of cut it up if you needed to, but I think when you're giving it and it's just one piece and it flows together, it sounds really nice, and that's great because it is not just a ritual, but it is, for the newly initiated entered apprentices. And when you're able to give it in such a way that it elicits a good emotion, that I think that's really special. I know that there are other lodges, and I think maybe we should probably start doing this at St. George's, but because, like you said, you get a fire hose of information. Some of the other lodges, what they do is they will just do the initiation on night, A, and then on night B, they will do the whys, the wherefores, the charge, and the historical lecture, breaking it up because just the degree by itself is, a long time.
Right.
And right, you're already bombarded with all that information, and you're blindfolded. It's a lot. So there are parts that I think might be better received if they were maybe given later, some other time, maybe a different day, just so again you have time to kind of chew on it, consume it, because there are so many good bits of information, and again, hidden jewels that if you miss them, you're not going to kind of realize them until you maybe have the opportunity to see it again, see somebody else do it, or like me. I mean, I don't even remember my historical lecture when it was given to me. It's a blur. It very much was a blur. And it's not like I was like, wow, look at that part. I remember the brother who gave it, and I remember that it was, an involved, long lecture, but I really couldn't tell you exactly how I felt at that moment because it was so just like an overwhelming experience in a good way of the whole night. So yeah, maybe splitting it up would be good, but it is a chock full, heavy bit.
Well, I'll never forget my historical lecture because you gave it.
Oh.
And I remember, what goes through, and we've talked some about this in previous seasons, the experience as an EA is that you come into a lodge, especially the night that you're going to be taking that EA degree, and you have, I would say, in your mind, your own file of what you think Freemasonry is about, whether it's the research you've done on your own that could wander off into some of the conspiracy theories or some of the historical part, or maybe some of the esoteric, if you can grasp all of that. And you just have tons of questions. And then you come in, and that initiatic experience is, unless you've gone through a college fraternity, maybe there would have been some of that
little crossover. Yeah.
But for the most part, you're like, okay, this is completely different. Even if I read the, Masonry for Dummies book and was kind of prepped on what's going to happen, you don't really experience it fully until you go through it. And then the historical lecture happens. And at that point, I do remember, because I just sat there and I was like, okay, here's this young guy, and he must really be into Freemasonry because he's getting up and he's talking about all these things, and he's walking around the lodge and pointing out to all these places. And I was like, wow, and he's just talking extemporaneously. And it wasn't until you used a couple of words that are in Old English where I'm like, wait a second, these aren't his words. Like,
that's great.
He's memorized. He's delivering this from memory. So I want to talk a little bit about the magic of how you deliver it, because there was a scare, and this was, I think, the part that I've mentioned on previous episodes, where you weren't going to be able to attend a first degree that we had. And I always joke with guys that know the historical lecture or the middle chamber lecture, like, you're basically going to get free nights, a couple free nights of dinner every year, because that's a very rare part for someone to master. And when you said you weren't going to be able to do it, the worshipful master that year was like, hey, what we'll do is we'll just break this up into sections, and each officer will deliver a paragraph or two. So I got the how Allah just situated, which I learned about, Noah and Israelites fleeing and parting the seas and the desert and all that. And then the point within a circle, which really caught my attention. And then thankfully you were like, hey, I'm able to make it that night. We were all like, oh, thank God. St. Matthew's here to save us. So tell us a little bit about, like, over the years, how you've embodied these words that obviously were written centuries before you became a Mason, and you've almost made them your own.
At first, I memorized it. I learned it cold, and that's what I think most good ritualists should do: is take the piece as it is written and learn it cold. That's got to be the first step, so that you can kind of understand it. And if you can give it basically to yourself in a mirror, then you can perform your duty as a brother to give that part. But then once you memorize it and you're comfortable reciting it, then you can start to kind of put your own spin on things. And this is where I'm going to get in trouble with all the ritualist purists out there. But I don't think that it needs to be word for word, and I'll get into that in a second, because sometimes I drop a word here, or I change the order of a few words over there, because it flows better, in my opinion. And again, that's just my opinion. I know a lot of folks see my father very much as a ritual purist to an extent, and I am a little bit, but I don't think that word for word memorization makes you a good ritualist. I think most of our ritualists, or rituals, I should say, I especially think that this one, as well as the middle chamber, like you said, and just the Heramic legend in general, are and should be performative. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying you should rewrite the lecture, as like a hip hop album, but I'm sure we would love that, and I would pay to see it, certainly. But what I mean is, you should put your own spin on it, because we can all recite something. If you try hard enough, we can all eventually get there. That's easy. Worst case scenario, you could read it right from the book, if you had to. But a good ritualist, I think, engages the audience. And this is a 20 to 30-minute monologue. I got to do something to keep these candidates attention, and prevent older folks like my dad from falling asleep. But they just went through a very long ordeal. Half of it, they are hoodwinked. And I could probably rant for another hour about ritual performance, but I could probably save that for a whole nother episode. But basically, to put a bow on it, I use my time to engage not just the new brothers, but the rest of the craft, because some of these people travel very far to see St. George's put on a degree. And not to toot our horn, but we take a lot of pride in it, and I think that's something that we really do well. And it's not just me; I mean, everyone. It's a whole degree, and I'm not even like 10% of the degree. It's a lot of other people. They do a great job. So you probably remember, when I talk about the pillar of beauty, usually I single out a brother. I'll make a face. I'll get a laugh or two. If I refer to like Cowens and eavesdroppers, I'll give a wink or a nod to somebody in the room. And if I see my dad sitting in the north, which we Masonically term a place of darkness, I'll get a laugh out of that. So those are moments that usually get a chuckle. And I think that's great, because at the end of the day, I want to engage everybody, brothers, new and old, and get them excited about ritual. So, hopefully it drives and, motivates other people to say, hey, wow, this ritual is actually kind of cool. Yeah, this could be neat. I could do that. And then, we see where it goes from there.
Do you kind of find your vein to be less acting out the ritual and more just kind of trying to embody the words?
Yeah, I do try to embody the words a lot. That is important to me, because I think the words are very powerful, and I think that the message in those words is important. So when I do emphasize, and when I really kind of stress certain sentences or words, I definitely think about, what is this piece of work, what is this art trying to say, and how do I do that, and how do I do it well, and how do I get engagement, and how do I really drive that point home. So I know, but I look out for those little parts. Some of the other parts, yes, it's definitely performative and more kind of acting, but that's the smaller bits, and really has nothing to do with the stressful, and not, I shouldn't say stressful, but the really important and quote unquote divine parts of the ritual. So
You mentioned dad, so we must talk
yep.
about your father, because I think you have one of the coolest Masonic stories that I know. Matthew's father is Right Worshipful Michael Brockbank, and he's known throughout New York State as one of the premier Masonic education mentors. Your father was actually the mentor for me and taught me the catechism for the Entered Apprentice and Fellowcraft degrees. We would often joke about what it must have been like growing up as the son or in the house of a famous Freemason. But what led you to want to knock on that door at St. George's Lodge specifically?
So I'll kind of answer this in like 2 or 3 parts here. Again, we could probably do a whole episode just on this. So yeah, for some of your listeners who don't know, my father, uh, has been a Mason since I think he was maybe 27, and so was my grandfather, and that was something that they shared. So my father always put Blue Lodge first, really above any other part of Masonry. As after members were initiated into the first degree, my father would mentor them, as Micah stated. He would work on them, teaching them the Q&As so they could, quote unquote, pass the test, move to Fellowcraft and be raised in Master Mason. So I remember these people showing up at my house when I was a kid, right? When I'm growing up, they'd walk in all confident for some reason, and then they'd leave looking so defeated. And I'm like, what is going on here?
Mhm.
So I think that's how, he earned the title of Dean of Brockbank University, because, these guys would come over, chuffed, and then just shook.
Mm,
It was never like that for me as much, because I knew, his, kind of way of teaching and things. But when I was a kid, I would kind of sneak into his closet and I would steal his York Rite, Knights Templar regalia.
mm.
Yeah, after my grandfather passed away, we had 2 sets of everything, which meant we had 2 sets of ceremonial swords,
Nice.
which my brother and I would definitely use for totally safe and non-combative things. Of course, we were studying them for the runes and the markings. Yeah,
Mm,
archaeologists in training, definitely not
right.
fencing at all. You know,
Lightsaber battles.
I don't know what you're talking about, man. That we
Right.
totally didn't use them for those purposes. And if my dad ever asks, I'm sticking to that story. Anyway, I always did think that the regalia was exquisite, really beautiful. Clearly these symbols, were something that I wanted to know about, which is funny because, my dad did kind of expose me to Masonry kind of like at every opportunity growing up. Not so much because he wanted me to be a Mason, but he was always busy with his obligations, but he still wanted to spend time with me. And I very much wanted to spend time with him on his, kind of journeys. So while he was the grand standard bearer for most worshipful Roswell Swits, this is back in the very early 90s. He would take me on trips to Utica, New York. While they were in their very closed door meetings, I would like run through the steam tunnels underneath the facility.
Hmm.
Not to say that, not saying like our house was like plastered with like Masonic like imagery or anything. It's, quite the opposite. My dad always kept Masonry like a guarded secret. I think he very much enjoyed the mystery of Freemasonry, and he wanted that for myself and others. He wouldn't harp on it or anything, but he wears a ring. It's a college ring that he's had since he graduated. After he became a Mason, I think the stone in his ring like cracked or something, so he replaced it with a piece of onyx, and he had the square compass and the G engraved in there, and that's literally it. Like that's all he ever had or would show anybody. My father was very much. He always said to me this, and I will never forget it. He said, "No matter where you go, you will always be proud to be a Mason, but it's not something that we should ever flaunt." He won't hate you if you have a bumper sticker, or a belt buckle, which I might have had for a little bit of time. So I totally had the belt buckle. He's just not going to be the guy who's going to wear 7 or 8 pins on his lapel, which it's definitely a weakness for some Masons. I don't know why, but we love our trinkets.
Right. Right. Well, you'll and those that in the know will understand the joke that I'm about to share. But this really happened. Is that your dad on his lapel would wear the Tubal Cain pin. And I remember going up to him and going,
Yep.
"Oh, Michael, did you just get on Facebook? And did they just give you like a Facebook
Oh,
pin?"
oh, because the F. Yeah.
And he's like, "Obviously, you don't know your ritual, brother." And I'm like, "Is there a
That's
Facebook
pretty
page
good.
for Masons somewhere that I'm not aware of?"
No, Facebook was founded by Freemasons, of course.
As one of the brothers that would show up to your house and wait for your dad to finish dinner, and then he would come out in his smoking jacket and bring us into his law office, and we'd sit down, and he would strum his fingers on the table and have his little bowl of peanuts and his bottles of water, and never ever had a ritual book open. Like,
Yeah.
dude knew or he knows where a comma should be instead of a period. Like, he corrects us like down to the letter. We would always joke, like, his son is a member of our lodge. Can you imagine what their conversations must have been like when Matthew was going through? Was it like watching Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker do like epic lightsaber battles?
Oh, come on. Oh, please. I'm not, you're making me blush. No, I mean, like, I always wanted to become a Mason, I think, ever since I was young, because of my grandfather and, because my dad and he did it together. I wanted to have that and share that with both of them. Even though I was never a Mason at the time that my grandfather was alive, it's still something that I feel like I'm doing with him, even though he's not around. And it's definitely something I enjoy with my father, 100%. That family thing is great. Becoming a Mason at St. George's, though, connected me to both of them, and it's something I'm very proud of. I think it makes my dad proud, but really, it fills me with pride. So it's definitely a me thing. And naturally, when I turned 21, and this is back in September of 08, that very day, the day I turned 21, I said, "Dad, I want to join St. George's." It was literally the first thing on my list after turning 21, probably after nursing the hangover from the night before.
Okay.
But yeah, it was definitely I was in the right mind. But I was like, "Hey, Dad," and that was definitely right off the bat. So I joined. I was living in college at the time, in New Jersey, attending Rutgers, and I had a single room in my fraternity house. So I would call my dad on the phone 2 or 3 times a week, and we would just do the Q&A on the phone over and over and over and over and over. So, we do it bit by bit until eventually I had the whole thing. And, he wanted to make sure that I was ready to proceed in Masonry, that I knew it cold. I'm not sure if that was a reflection on him or not, maybe, but I remembered my first degree as a candidate, and everyone was literally flawless. I mean, when I say that, I remember them, bestowing the degree on me. Everyone who gave the degree was flawless. So, the first day that I'm literally in the lodge, I'm like, wow, these guys are perfect. I need to be perfect because they are so good at it. So honestly, I don't think that there was a single prompt, when I went and became an entered apprentice. So from the start, I was instilled with the desire to know the material, not just, because of dad, he could recite it, in his sleep, but in terms of like everyday happenings, we don't talk about ritual as much, dad and I, because usually when I'm with him, my brother or my mom or other family members might be around, which is normal, but we always try to maximize family time. But while I was briefly living at home and attending a lodge pretty regularly at first, we would often drive to lodge together. And in the car, that's all we would talk about is ritual. We talk about this part, talk about that part. What does this really mean? What about that? Because it's not, you don't know ritual. You don't know the words until you have to memorize them and give them. I realized that, like, you can listen to it 100 times, but I didn't understand a lot of the first degree historical lecture until I gave it. And it was only after giving it that it was like, oh my God.
Yeah, I would agree with you. As we get back to that focus, that I had seen a few EA degrees since becoming a master mason and officer of the lodge, and it was my year as a senior deacon that we were going to put on a first degree that you weren't going to be able to be there. And then thank God you showed up. But when I was given that part, I'm like, I am really unfamiliar with this. I've actually never read this. And I found it, I still believe in this, is that we do our biggest learning in Freemasonry when we prepare to share that experience of the degree with the next guy. And that's when I really studied those words and was like, wow, this is what Matthew was talking about. I was really blown away with your mannerisms and how you were walking around, the personality, and I was listening to the words. But as you kind of pointed out, like, it was really getting into reading between those lines that meant something to me. So I'm just curious. We've mentioned with kind of broad brushstrokes, but are there particular sections of the historical lecture that you almost get excited to get ready to share because they're your favorite part?
Absolutely. Again, I don't know how much time we have here, but
Much as you need.
yeah. I know it's not a real answer, but I do want to say, most of it, because almost all of the lecture is not encoded. It's general knowledge to all people. And there's something nice about that. As I go through the lecture, there are certainly a few parts here and there that, hit a little different. Firstly, and I know you've done an episode, it was great, on Jacob's Ladder, which talks about, let me back up. So, Jacob's Ladder is, I think, in my opinion, a nice part because it talks about faith, hope, and charity. Again, this is, not encoded words, but it ends with the greatest of these being charity. For faith may be lost in sight, hope end in fruition, but charity extends beyond the grave, throughout the boundless realms of eternity. And that part to me is really excellent because charity is, at the end of the day, how we as Freemasons like tangibly affect the real world. You know, we're clothing people. We're feeding people. We're providing, world-class medical care. We do all of these things free of charge. Yeah, we have our own little Masonic things, but we do affect the outside world, and charity is the way in which we do it the most. And I think that that is just really special. It's really nice. It makes you feel good. I think, I would hope that other people think so too, and can look past the quote unquote secrets of Freemasonry, and realize that at the end of the day, yeah, you got your things, you got your rituals, you've got your clothing, but you're actually out here, doing good. So charity important, and I like that. My very favorite part though is probably the end of the lecture. Maybe just because I've been talking for 30 minutes straight. No, I think as this lecture was first written and later revised, I would say that the end, the very last section, is just pure poetry. It's how an entered apprentice should serve his master, and it just, oof, like every part of it just hits, and it's good because it follows the rule of three, which is great. But at the very end, I think really the cherry on top of this entire cake, and I'm talking like from the very first part of the historical lecture, this is the very last, kind of chunk. It's just perfect. So nothing is more zealous than clay, our Mother Earth, for it alone of all elements has never proved unfriendly to man. Though harassed more for the luxuries and the necessities of life, she never refuses her yield, strewing our pathways with flowers and spreading our tables with plenty. Though she produces poison, still she furnishes the antidote, and returns with interest every good entrusted to her care. And when at last you are called to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, she once more receives us, and tenderly enfolds our remains within her bosom, thus admonishing us that from earth we came, so to earth we must surely return. Chef's kiss. And that part is just, to me, so good. It's like someone else wrote the rest of the historical lecture, like you said, in that, like, historical old English. But then they were just like, hey, Shakespeare, come here, and like write this last part for us. And it's just so good. I don't know why, but it's like a different person wrote it. And it really just, it flows well. It feels good, and like when you end it, it just, yeah, it's perfect. It's so, anyway, poetry is the only way I can express it. But most of the lecture, it's guidelines on how things should be set up and where things should go. Right? It's kind of like rules of the lodge. But that last part is Really nice. And I know you've already spoken about, the perfect points of your entrance on a previous episode, which is part of the historical lecture. So I won't belabor those, even though I have kind of a few different opinions, contrary to you and Brother John. The allegory that I like best is, of course, I think the rough ashlar, perfect ashlar allegory as well. It straight up calls us out for being, imperfect humans, and it illuminates, kind of like our journey, and that's really great through life. Hopefully, we can end our last day with, putting that last kind of final finishing touch on the ashlar. That's the way I see it, is like, we are rough ashlars as babies, and then we're handing the working tools. And the perfect ashlar is not something that you are trying to achieve now. It's something that you hope to achieve, when you put those tools down. When the tools go down, the ashlar is finished. And I see it as the ashlar is never finished until that time when you are, quote unquote, judged. So I like that allegory a lot.
So, Matthew, you and I are both members of St. George's Lodge number 6. It's one of the few colonial lodges that's still operating in New York State. So for our listener that's not in the know, that means this lodge is older than our country. It was chartered back in 1774 while English troops were in the Stockade District of Schenectady, New York. With that deep history, some would say a legacy, you're not the first father-son Master Mason combo with you and your dad, nor are you the most recent. Can you share a little bit about your experience when Worshipful Brother Paul Holsapple, his son Zachary, took the solemn obligation to become an Entered Apprentice Mason?
From my experience with my father teaching me and eventually raising me to Master Mason, I already knew that this was going to be a really great moment for them, and hopefully, for the rest of us. It was for me, because I saw myself in him, and I saw my dad and Paul. So I was like, yeah, this is going to be good. First, though, I did, well, my cable toe is much shorter now than it ever was before. So I first was like, I'm not sure, do I have the time? Because I now live more than an hour away from the lodge, and I am busier than I ever have been. Being a homeowner and everything now, and it's just, there's a lot, right? So at first I said, can I make it? I don't know. But I remembered my experience with my dad, and I was like, you know what? No, I will move mountains to be there, because I know how important this moment is, especially for family members, but definitely for father and sons. Because, yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's much better than that, right? Father, son, masonry. It's just special. Speaking from experience, that is. So anyway, I knew it was going to be great. I was happy to be a part of it. As you can imagine, it's a very powerful and emotional moment, for them, as it was, for the rest of us. I can't wait for him to be raised, because, well, Paul, if you're listening, I know that you're going to lose it, and that's okay. We're going to be there for you. When that moment comes, and we'll be there to support both of you, because I know that when my father raised me, I cannot put it into words. I really cannot. One of the most powerful experiences. I remember, it's so vivid in my mind. Just everything, what I saw, the words. It's undescribable. So that was just it. It lives in my mind as one of the most special memories ever. Period. And I don't have any children, so this is probably the most special moment.
No pressure on that front, right?
No pressure, yeah, right? No pressure.
For this time, I want to thank you, Brother Matthew Brockbank, for coming on the Craftsman Online podcast. I've picked up what you're putting down. I speak the lingo. So we are going to get you back on the podcast. But for this episode, thank you so much for sharing your light and laughter.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure. I enjoyed getting ready for this. I was like psyched all week. I'm like, podcast. I'm excited. This is great. Mike, I want to say, though, I admire very, very much what you're doing. I think this is fantastic. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for everything you do, and keep doing it, man. Keep doing it.
If you've enjoyed our podcast and you want to hear more, you can tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online podcast. We're available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.